Shalom Nikulam. Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem, Israel. It's great to have an international crowd with us as usual, from Israel, the United States, the UK, across Europe, Australia, and other places. So thank you very much for joining us. For any newcomers, I'll just fill you in that this is a weekly thing that we've been doing now pretty much since Corona hit, where we have a weekly, every Wednesday, Zoom event in English, usually me talking to a special guest about a topic that's relevant for one of the many areas that we focus on here at the Begin Center to do with Israeli history and politics, the wider Middle East, Zionism, the Jewish world, and other things. I should say also that the topic we're dealing with today, the Abraham Accords and its aftermath, is actually something we've dealt with. I think this is maybe the third session we've had dealing specifically with something related to the Abraham Accords, which is reflective both of how important we think it is in terms of just as a historic event in the Middle East and relating to Israel, and also because, of course, Menachem Begin sort of got the ball rolling in terms of Israel's relations with, or opening relations with Arab states by signing that first peace agreement with Egypt back in 1979. And so we regard it as very much part of his legacy, the continuing opening up of Israel to the Arab states. So with that in mind, I'm going to, just before I introduce our guest, I'm going to speak to him for about half an hour, and then we'll get to questions from you guys. So please do write questions in to the chat using the chat facility at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those questions in about half an hour. All right. I'm extremely happy and privileged to have with me in the Zoom room, as it were, Dan Feferman, who's an author, speaker, and researcher who focuses on Israel, the Jewish world, the Middle East. He's published numerous articles. He speaks regularly in Israel and around the world, and he's a co-host of the Jewanced Podcast. We can ask him to put a link to that in the chat for people interested. He's a fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute, which is a leading think tank here in Jerusalem on issues of importance to Israel and the Jewish people. And he's active in Israel-UAE relations, which is what we're going to be talking about today. He's the Director of Communications and Global Affairs at Sharaka, which is the newish NGO that we're going to be hearing about. He's also a founding member of the UAE Israel Business Council and founded and heads the Gulf Israel Policy Forum. Dan, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you, Paul.
We all know about the Abraham Accords. We're going to be talking about why it's so important. We're going to be learning, I think, much more about it from you today. But I don't think many of us on this call know about Sharaka or know as much as we should. So can you just give us a kind of potted history? What is Sharaka? Who founded it? What were the aims of the organization?
Gladly. Sharaka, which means partnership in Arabic, is an Israeli Emirati NGO founded a little bit after the signing of the Accords. A group of young Israeli leaders, a multi-faith group, Jews, Arabs, Christians, Muslims, Druze, decided to get on a plane led by an Israeli, call him a social entrepreneur named Amit Deri, and head to the Gulf to try to connect with young leaders there, eager to get to know Israelis. And what ended up forming was a visit by these Israelis to the UAE, one of the first organized non-governmental visits. And then Sharaka was formed and brought a group of young Emirati and Bahraini social leaders, influencers to Israel. This was in Hanukkah of last year, so just a year ago. And they ended up forming together with the Emirati co-founder, Dr. Majid al-Sarraj, this organization called Sharaka. Sharaka is intended to take the governmental agreements and really ensure that they translate to the people-to-people level. So kind of I hate to use the word learning from the mistakes, but taking the opportunity that was missed with Egypt and Jordan, and not to discredit that piece, which was incredibly brave for those countries. And you mentioned Menachem Begin, Zichrono Livracha, and his legacy and what was achieved with Egypt. But to make sure we don't miss this historic opportunity to translate this, I had been active on a personal level and through the UAE Israel Business Council, an organization founded by my good friend, businessman Dorian Barak. And of course, a lot of people in this room probably know of Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, Fleur Hassan Nahum, and others who founded it. And I was one of the original founders. And so I became quickly involved in forging ties between Israel and the Gulf. I was one of the first to visit, forged many friendships. I helped found a policy forum, a forum of policymakers and analysts and influencers in that regard. And I was invited by the leaders of Sharaka to basically run and coordinate kind of the day-to-day activities. So I'm based here in Israel, although I'm flying a lot to the U.S. and to the Gulf. We have another senior partner, a good friend of mine, Omar El Busaidi, who's heading our efforts in the United States. Dr. Majid is heading the efforts in the UAE. We just brought on another associate in the Gulf, and we have many, many volunteers and people in different capacities who are in what is essentially a movement for a new paradigm for peace in the region. And we are doing all our efforts to help bring together Israelis, people from the Gulf, also now Moroccans. We're trying to expand our efforts to Morocco, and we're getting a lot of support and also people from other parts of the Arab and Muslim world who are really, really eager to connect and support this new paradigm.
Wow, that's a really positive start. When you first said about the people to people element, my first thought was that, of course, this is the exact opposite of what happened with Egypt and Jordan, as you mentioned, the sort of cold peace reality of what happened. Do you think that is there something specific about the nature of the relationship between Israel and the UAE and Israel and Bahrain which made that possible? Is it simply that no one did a Sharaka type thing back in the early 80s with Egypt or the early 90s with Jordan? Or is there something else about either the nature of the agreements or the relations between the governments, or indeed maybe the nature of the societies that we're talking about, as opposed to Egypt and Jordan?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I mean, again, I don't want to discredit what was achieved with Egypt and what was achieved with Jordan. We have to recall that Israel had bloody, vicious wars with those countries. There were territorial disputes with those countries. There were people killed in wars with those countries. And so there was animosity there that never really existed with the countries in the Gulf and in Morocco, which are kind of on the edges, literally, of the Arab world. What wasn't achieved and what was maybe a missed opportunity is something that the governments of these countries, I think, realized full well. And there's a number of elements, and I'll try to tie them in all together. And that's understanding. I think there's a growing understanding in the UAE, in Bahrain, in Morocco, who are leading these efforts. I think we're also, by the way, seeing signs of this in Saudi Arabia and in Egypt and other parts of the Arab world, that the anti-Israel sentiment, anti-Semitism, classic raw anti-Semitism, first of all, is a detriment to their own societies. It is, I think they realize that it is maybe a bellwether, maybe a sign of general lack of tolerance, lack of pluralism. And this kind of mindset harms first and foremost themselves. I think it comes from that kind of understanding. Now, when you didn't have a conflict specifically with Israel, it makes it a lot easier. Now, let's also look at the region of the Gulf, and let's look at, in a different way, Morocco, but the region of Gulf specifically is an area that is incredibly cosmopolitan. It's an area of traders and merchants and people from all over the world going back and forth. If you've never been to the UAE, it's a hub. It's an incredibly multicultural hub. And so this kind of concept of tolerance of other cultures, of other religions, of other languages is shockingly deep for at least from an Israeli or a Western point of view, when everything you've come to think about the Arab world as being an intolerant place, and then you all of a sudden go to the UAE, and I was shocked by how tolerant it was. But it's not also by accident. We have to credit the leadership over there, the leadership in the UAE, the leadership in Bahrain, the leadership in Morocco, who realized after 9/11, after seeing what political Islamism has done to the region, to their own countries, to their own societies. I think it was a wake up call, and they realized that they first and foremost have to educate their own populations and then the broader regions around them to tolerance of other religions, of other peoples, and of course Israel and the Jewish people included in that. And so there's been a long approach. Anyway, I've been watching the Middle East for my entire adult life and part of my juvenile life, let's call it. And you see the trend in the Gulf, in the region, towards, slowly changing the education curriculum, the public official messaging in the press, the way that they react first to Jews from the U.S. or from Europe, because in the Gulf they don't have native Jewish communities. Bahrain is a very small one, but the UAE didn't have an indigenous Jewish community. And in Morocco, which still does, and has a very long and proud Jewish history, there's been a reclamation and kind of a resurgence of that pride in its Jewish heritage. And this is a process, and it's a very deliberate process, and it's been unrolling for a long time, and preparing their publics for this day. And that's why you didn't see a lot of outrage when the Abraham Accords were announced, certainly in the countries that signed, but even in the broader region, you did not see a lot of outrage when these four countries, the UAE first, then Bahrain, then Sudan, actually, and Morocco, all announced that they were signing peace and normalization agreements with Israel.
That's really fascinating. And I think, like, as you said, we don't have that. Most of us, at least, and certainly speaking for myself, don't have that knowledge of the Gulf states. And we do think, when we think of the Arab countries, we think of the Arab countries that Israel has been fighting for its entire existence, which did include, of course, Egypt and Jordan, and didn't include, as you say, the UAE and Bahrain. That said, I assume that they nevertheless, the populations at least, did and do have a sympathy with the Palestinians and the cause of Palestinian statehood. So how does that play in? Because obviously, there's the famous unfortunate John Kerry remark of a few years ago, when he insisted that there will never be peace between Israel and any Arab state as long as the Palestinian issue remains unresolved. And clearly that's not the case. But nevertheless, it remains this outstanding issue. How does that play into your engagements with everyday folk in the Gulf states?
Look, I'll say this incredibly candidly. I think when the accords were announced, there were more than a few voices here in Israel that said, "Oh, finally we can kind of ignore or get around the Palestinian issue." And by the way, when we go on speaking tours, when we go on Sharaka speaking tours in the United States, that's one of the first questions we get in many of the audiences we speak to. And I always leave it to my my Arab and my Muslim friends and colleagues to answer that question. And it's very obvious that nobody's going to ignore that issue. It can't be ignored from the Arab perspective. It cannot be ignored. It won't be ignored. It is something that they want to see resolved, while recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, while recognizing Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people. And some of them know what that means, and some of them are learning what that means and accepting what that means. But also recognizing that there was, in their words, again, an injustice done 70-something odd years ago, and we need to work together to figure out how to resolve it. There is also a growing realization that it takes two to tango, I think, that the Palestinian leadership is as much to blame for the lack of any solution. And I'll quote a colleague and a friend of mine who's Saudi and who teaches in the UAE, very bluntly from a lecture we gave at the University of Chicago just last week. The Arab world strategy, the Palestinian strategy of the last 7 decades to boycott and ignore Israel and hinge Israel's normalization and relations with the rest of the region until the Palestinian issue is solved has gotten everybody nowhere. And so why would they keep beating a dead horse, so to speak, if it's not working? I'll be the first to say, and I'm a proud Israeli and I'm a proud Zionist, and I'm a former major in the IDF, and I'll take my hats off to them. If boycotting Israel and isolating Israel worked, I'd say go for it. Keep doing what you're doing. It hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. It's made the Palestinians more, dig in their own position and be more maximalist. I think it's made us, be more reticent because we say, well, they're never going to be happy with what we've offered in 2000 and 2001 and 2008 and 2014. So what more can we offer if they're never going to accept it? And I think it's made the Palestinians say, the world's behind us, the region's behind us. So if we just keep digging in, they'll keep coming to us. Yeah. And the region, I think, finally started saying, guys, it's not going to happen. Yeah. There's a lot to be gained from cooperation with Israel. There's a lot of regional issues, whether it's extremism, whether it's Iran, the Iran challenge, whether it's environment, desert, food security, water issues, tech, medicine, that need to be challenged together with Israel because they also recognize Israel has so much to offer. And if you guys, I'm speaking in the voice of the Arab countries, if you guys, the Palestinians, aren't going to get your act together, we're going to try a different approach. And I think they see their role as now having a seat at the table and being able to say to Israel as a friend now, and not as someone on the outside, Israel, you need to also come back to the table. You need to give something here too. So I think it's just a different approach. I think it's a friendly approach and not ignoring the Palestinian issue at all.
That's fascinating. So you mentioned about that some of the Arabs that you're dealing with have more knowledge than others about Israel as a Jewish state and what that means and who the Jews are. And I, in looking at the website of Sharaka and reading about what you've been up to, one of the really fascinating stories I saw was this, and I also saw it at the time in the press, was this visit of a delegation from Bahrain to Jerusalem and to the old city and to the Kotel. Can you tell us about that? Who were they? Who were these Bahrainis?
So in October, we had a delegation of Bahrainis, influencers, some people who are popular on social media, some people who are in government, in academia, in the policy world. And we organized the first Bahraini delegation to come. And for all of them except one who was on the previous delegation, and then she helped lead this delegation, it was their first experience to Israel. Some of them knew more, some of them knew less. One of them actually has been learning Hebrew and teaching Hebrew in Bahrain. Wow. And, for all of them, it was, I think, a shocking experience. Bahrain, by the way, unlike the UAE, there is more of a disconnect between many of the people and the leadership. And so it's not as, the accords and the peace agreement with Israel are not as popular.
Is that a Shiite Sunni thing as well?
It's partly a Shiite Sunni thing, yes. Much of the population, I believe over 60% of the population of Bahrain is Shia. And closer to Iran in that sense.
Right.
And so they're also more radicalized on Israel regarding that issue. And what happened is, you had a week of fairly influential Bahrainis, many of them, with thousands of Twitter followers and Instagram followers, tweeting their experiences. And we took them to all parts of Israeli society. We didn't hide anything. They met with, Jews of all political and religious stripes, Arabs of different political and religious stripes. We took them in the streets of Jerusalem, where they were welcomed by most and harassed by some also. And, we let them digest their own experiences and tweet and report whatever it is they wanted. And we think, and this is part of our strategy, is little by little, these kinds of visits change minds. Both in Israel regarding the Arab world, and in the Arab world regarding Israel.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing. Another trip that I saw was the trip that you and others took to the US, to San Francisco and the Bay Area. And I saw that the delegation was not just you and some Gulf Arabs, but also I think someone from Morocco, a journalist from Syria. What was that trip about? And who were these additional Arabs that were on the trip, the non-Gulf?
Sure. So, as I said, we're trying to grow Sharaka as a movement, a real movement of a new paradigm for the region. So we put together a really fascinating delegation of fantastic people, young leaders. We had my Emirati partner in Sharaka, Omar, who heads our U.S. affairs. He lives in the U.S. and represents us over there. So we had an Emirati, and then we had a woman from Bahrain who has now started working for us. She's an author in Bahrain, a published author. We had a Moroccan woman who now goes between Dubai, Morocco, and New York. She's an artist. She's an intellectual. She's a scholar. She's a policy advisor. We had a Syrian-born journalist and television presenter who had to flee Syria, and she now lives in the United States. And part of the reason why she left Syria was the war. Part of the reason why she left Syria was because of her incredibly public opinions about the need to normalize with Israel and make peace, and understanding that it is Iran and Hezbollah that are the agents of chaos in the region and not Israel. And sadly, she has many fans in the region, but she also has some critics because of that. We had an Israeli Arab, a Druze woman who is in charge of social media in Arabic, actually, for the foreign ministry, but she came on a private capacity and not as a government official. And I had the honor of being the only Israeli Jew on the entire panel. And we went around the entire Bay Area, Northern California, and Sacramento, and we met with Jewish communities. We met with intellectual crowds. We went to universities. We spoke at the Commonwealth Club. We went to synagogues and community centers and Democratic Party clubs. We met with progressive politicians, and each crowd, every single one, even if they were skeptical or hesitant at first, I think immediately recognized the magnitude of what is happening here.
It's amazing, and I would recommend to everyone that if you go on the Sharaka website and look at where there's media, read up some of the articles about that trip, because I thought it was fascinating. Partly because I think many of us are used to either reading about or personally experiencing the anti-Israel stuff that we get from mainly progressives in the West, and here they were in one of the most progressive cities in the West, San Francisco, having to face up to the fact that there are Arabs Arabs in the Middle East that are telling them, listen, it's not the cartoon black and white, picture that you think it is. There was a great moment I read where I think someone in the audience said, how can we support the Abraham Accords, because that dictator Netanyahu was involved, and the Syrian journalist says, I know what dictator is. that was great.
Indeed. And I remember, I don't know if it was at that event or at a different event, I also responded to that gentleman. And I said, excuse me, you don't have to like Netanyahu, but he was talking about Netanyahu speaking as a dictator. And I said, or he said as an authoritarian. He called him, I guess this was a different quote, because I responded to somebody in the crowd calling Netanyahu an authoritarian. I said, excuse me, he was elected fair and square by the Israeli public, 4 times, 5 times in a row. You don't have to like him, but let's be very careful with our words here and not discredit, the outcome of a democratic election. But yeah, I remember Havi Buzo by their name, and actually, hopefully, she'll be coming to Israel for the first time.
Fantastic.
This week, so we hope to be hosting her
Amazing.
Yeah.
Actually, that point, that Netanyahu point, I think takes me to I'll make this my last question, and I'll go to questions from the audience and continue writing them in, guys. I'll get to them. I imagine one of the problems in sort of selling this to the wider world is that the two leaders most associated with them are Netanyahu and Donald Trump, who are, let's be fair, not popular, rightly or wrongly, we're not going to get into it now, but are not popular in many other countries, in many other Western countries. And so there's an automatic dismissal, I think, from some people of the Abraham Accords. Also, I think people unfairly tie it to the Trump peace plan, which people don't like, when I think it should be seen separately. But I mean, is that something you had to deal with, something you've had to confront, that kind of, and at best, ambivalence about the Abraham Accords, or ignorance about it?
No, it's a very good question. Yeah, and that's actually our biggest goal in sending these delegations to the West, starting with the United States, is confronting this lack of awareness, skepticism, lack of knowledge about the Accords and their influence, or a lot of questions about, well, isn't this really an arms deal? Isn't this just an economic business deal between the leaders? Yeah. And one of our key messages is that, yes, two of the leaders involved in this are incredibly polarizing and deeply unpopular to many parts of the West, Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. And regardless of your, we told people, stop taking your own domestic politics and projecting them on the Middle East, because at the end of the day, this is very real for us, Middle Easterners, Israelis, Jews and Arabs from around the region. On the previous speaking panel, we had a Saudi with us also, who spoke from that aspect. And our message is, this is real. This is transforming the region. This is single-handedly one of the most fundamental, transformative moments of the modern Middle East. And you're dismissing it because it's connected to a politician that you don't like, right, or that you despise. Right. And I get where it comes from. And that's why we show up to tell them, maybe you need to be a lot more open-minded about this and look at what it's actually happening on the ground. Look at what young people from across the Middle East are telling you. This has transformed the region. And, we spoke last night with Congressman Ted Deutsch, a Democrat. We spoke with Congressman Ro Khanna, who's affiliated, or who I think he was one of Bernie Sanders' main, supporters in California. Wow. And they, even people like that immediately get on board, because I told them, there's no reason why the current administration can't pick this up and make it even bigger and keep the momentum going. This needs to be a win for everybody. It's bipartisan in the Middle East. It's bipartisan in Israel. It's bipartisan in the countries that signed on. Mm-hmm. It's got so much public support, especially among the younger generation around the region. This is an easy win for any administration, any other country that wants to pick it up and support it. So, that was really one of our key messages and the reason why we go to the West and do what we do. Okay,
fantastic. Okay, let's go to questions, and I'll go to this one just because it follows a little nicely on from something you just said about the bipartisanship, in the bipartisan support for this, or certainly there should be bipartisan support for it. So Dan Weintraub had a couple of questions. One was, he says, has the Biden administration continued the process, and which Arab countries do you think are most likely to join next? And connected to that is whether you think the breakdown in the JCPOA talks makes it more likely that Saudi Arabia moves forward on the accord, on an accord with Israel.
Good question. I'm going to see if I can pull it up in the chat, because it's a...
Wait, it was sent just to me, I'm afraid.
Oh, sent just to you. Do you mind repeating?
Yeah, yeah, sure. So has the Biden administration continued the process, and which Arab countries do you think are most likely to join? Okay. Next. And does the breakdown in the JCPOA make it more likely that Saudi Arabia moves forward on an accord with Israel?
So after about a year of downplaying, ignoring, not even calling it by name, calling it the normalization agreements, as opposed to the Abraham Accords, Which, by the way, I want to point out, the Abraham Accords, if anyone who's just even barely paying attention, the symbolic aspect of calling it the Abraham Accords gives them so much more legitimacy from a regional perspective, because it is flat out telling people we are all the children of Abraham and Sarah, or Abraham and Hagar, whichever, but the children of Abraham.
Children of Abraham, yes.
The children of Abraham. And so it gives it this unbelievable legitimacy that is necessary for it to have that deep element. Now it seems that the Biden administration has woken up to it, and is trying to invest efforts once again in it. But I might be wrong. I'm not seeing those efforts on the ground, and I hope I will be proven wrong. Regarding which countries may join, certainly the immediate candidates are more countries from the Gulf, because it's far away. Israel has long had secret, less secret, not so secret, pragmatic relations with the Gulf. Oman is a natural candidate. Saudi Arabia is coming along, and I think we will see. I hope, and I don't think it's crazy to say in the near future, maybe not a year or two, but I think we will see Saudi Arabia. If you follow the trends in Saudi Arabia, it's moving in that direction.
Wow.
But they have to consider the legitimacy of the rest of the region, because they are the custodians of the two holiest sites in Islam. So they can't just act on their own. You see moves in North Africa. You could see moves in Tunisia. And actually, if anyone was following the news here and things that I've been hearing quietly from behind the scenes, there's even a dark horse in the competition called Libya.
Wow.
That
which regime?
Exactly. And,
that's part of the problem, right? Libya is
it's part of the problem, and one of them I think is more amenable to the idea than the other.
Right. Yes.
So, and then you're looking at other countries beyond the direct Middle East that are Muslim countries. I actually just got off a Zoom call organized by the Moshe Dayan Center at the University of Tel Aviv that brought together Pakistanis who are interested in normalization with Israel, and Pakistan is a major player in the Muslim world. So there are many more things that can be done.
Fascinating.
For any American or European or other Middle Eastern, kind of country that wants to advance these things along. Regarding your question on Iran, it's a tough one, because the threat of Iran's aggression in the region, and kind of what cemented with the Abraham Accords was a trend that had already been happening. And I've been speaking about this and writing about this for years, and that's a restructuring of the camps, restructuring of the axes in the Middle East, where now we can say quite authoritatively there are now 3 new camps in the Middle East. We used to talk about pro-West, pro-Soviet Union, the Arabists, and the Islamists and the seculars. And now we can say there is quite firmly a pro-peace, moderate Islam, pro-West camp, in which Israel is included now. It includes most of the Sunni world, whether officially or unofficially, and Israel. You then have a kind of looser and somewhat pragmatic Sunni, a radical Sunni camp that's funded by Qatar. And actually, if you listen to my last podcast episode from last week with John Chanzer from FDD, we talk all about this dynamic. And Turkey has played a big part. And everywhere where you see Muslim Brotherhood elements, that's the Qatar-Turkey Muslim Brotherhood element aspect. And then, of course, Iran and Iran's money and Iran's forces and Iran's radicalism. And that includes big parts of Iraq and Syria and Hezbollah, which dominates Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen.
Yeah.
And that dynamic was essentially cemented with the Abraham Accords. The JCPOA, I don't see the U.S. taking a tough line on Iran. And what's going to happen is what happens all the time in the Middle East. The Gulf countries that are concerned, to say the least, with Iran are not going to confront it directly. They're going to be publicly very nice, diplomatic. You see sort of a warming of ties between the UAE and Iran recently. They might do other things behind the scenes. There's, of course, a very well-known Cold War, kind of shadow war between Saudi Arabia and Iran that's been playing out.
Right.
But
not so cold at the moment, in fact.
Yeah. But on the official level, it will lead these countries to say, well, the U.S. is backing out, so we need to play nice.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So Shmuel Yerushalmi, hi Shmuel. He has a question about whether he asked how is Sharaka planning to support in practice Israeli-Arab cooperation in industrial and agricultural projects?
Israeli cooperation between Israelis and the Arab world? Is that
yes, I think that's what he means. Yes.
So what we're trying to do in Sharaka is create those connections and then bring together relevant organizations to be able to then continue these collaborations. So we're trying to act as kind of a hub for collaborations on the sub-governmental level, on the citizen level, whether it's academic, whether it's youth groups, whether it's cultural groups. We're, of course, a nonprofit organization, so we're not business consultants in that sense.
Right.
But anywhere where we can bring together the connection, bring the organization, the influencer, whatever it is, together, we're going to do that. Just next week, we are helping bring leading Israeli educators from the Council of Youth Organizations, 25 heads of youth organizations, to the UAE and helping them connect with counterparts in the UAE for academic collaboration. So anywhere where we can come in and help be that bridge, we're going to do that.
Amazing. So a question from Ron here, who says, has there been any indirect benefit of the Abraham Accord toward giving the Palestinians more incentive to improve the quality of life and infrastructure rather than perpetuating violence?
Yeah, I think it's going to take time, though. I think it's going to take time.
Right.
You know, it's going to take time. Look, they feel betrayed. They feel abandoned. I get it. And I think that the UAE and Bahrain gets it also. And so they're being patient.
Yeah.
They feel like their cause was abandoned. I don't think they're seeing it for what it is from the Gulf perspective. And that's just a new approach because, as I said earlier, the old approach wasn't working. Over time, I think if they're wise, they will see that there are many benefits that can be reaped from this, practical benefits and ultimately political benefits too.
Right. Yeah, I think that should be the hope of all of us with regard to that. Can you tell us something about the countries themselves? Because obviously you've been involved in this. You visited Bahrain as well.
I have yet to visit Bahrain. Yeah, unfortunately, with the constant COVID restrictions, I also I haven't traveled nearly as much as I would have liked to the last year.
Right, fair enough.
Yeah.
But certainly you've been to the UAE, and you've already said something about the surprising level of tolerance and diversity in that country. But I think, again, we think of the Arab world, we think of obviously our immediate neighbors, and even if we know on some level that just from even things that we've, pictures that we've seen or videos that Abu Dhabi and Dubai and not Damascus or Cairo. What are those societies like? If we think, if we think of Saudi Arabia as the giant Gulf state, which is this theocratic, pro-Western, but certainly from our point of view as Westerners or as Democrats, shall we say, a kind of an oppressive society. How does the UAE compare to that? Is it religious? Is it conservative?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, one of the immediate things I came to know, because when you go to the UAE, you meet also Arabs from all over the Arab world. The majority, the Emiratis themselves, the citizens themselves, are about 10% of their own country. The other 90% are foreign workers, and many of those many of those, maybe a third, maybe more, are Arabs from other parts of the Arab world who have lived there for years and are fully integrated into society. So you first of all realize that the Arab world is anything but monolithic.
Right.
The differences between the countries, between the cultures within the countries themselves is quite vast.
Yeah.
Some places are incredibly secular, incredibly Western in a sense. Some places are far more traditional. So let's put that. I also came to learn from conversations with people from Saudi Arabia and people who spend a lot of time in Saudi Arabia that Saudi Arabia itself has undergone a lot of changes in recent years, especially since the ascent of Mohammed bin Salman, MBS. Someone else who I think is misunderstood and not liked so much in many parts of the West. They've repealed this theocracy to a large extent. They are making serious moves towards accommodating secularization, repealing many of the strict layers of Sharia law, opening up society more and more to women. Women used to not be able to leave the house without a male guardian. They used to not be able to drive. All of these things have been repealed. Things are opening up for foreign tourists, for non-Muslim tourism. And so even Saudi Arabia is now moving in this direction. What did I see? I saw a society that respects its heritage, both its Arab heritage, its Bedouin Arab heritage, but also Islam.
Right.
And if I can bring this to a Jewish audience, I would say it seemed to me very much like if you took modern Orthodoxy or maybe even sort of a reform or conservative Judaism and took the Islamic equivalent of that without giving it a name. And that's what I saw over there. For the most part, you saw people who were almost moving towards a postmodernism in their religious understanding and thoughts. Traditions are important.
Yeah.
Everyone fasts on Ramadan and celebrates the major holidays, but not taking, for the most part, and some people are still religious and conservative in that sense, but not taking the Quran literally. Maybe more metaphorically, like most, I think, Jews do, and even among those in the UAE who are more religiously observant, the ones who pray 5 times a day and are much more strict in their observance, you see a tolerance, a true tolerance for people who don't think like them. And I think from everything that I've learned and understood, that's something that's been inculcated by their leadership for decades, really since their founding.
That's very interesting. I mean, that's interesting because I wonder what they make of Israel, because obviously Israel, as you said, many of them, they won't have been here before, or they know a little about it, but many not that much. They think of Israel Jewish state, and they don't know what that means. Right. And I guess like a lot of Westerners that have never been to Israel, they might see pictures of Jerusalem and like Haredim at the Kotel and think everyone walks around in Israel wearing a black hat. You know what I mean? And I want, do they when they come to Israel, or when you educate them about Israel, is it a surprise to them to learn that there's this massive diversity of religious observance and the extent to which halakha is important to people varies enormously? Is that what do they think of that?
Yeah, it's for me, that's one of the most fascinating things, is for me asking those questions of them and them asking those questions of me. Of course, because again, because of COVID, with the exception of one delegation we brought and then some governmental people, they haven't been here yet. And we were actually right before the Omicron travel restrictions, we actually had a fantastic group of Emirati influencers who were supposed to get on a plane and come here with Sharaka. I hope to bring them as soon as this is over. Some of them are more learned than others. Many of them have studied and traveled extensively around the world in the West, where they meet Jews, where they meet Israelis, where they have fantastic engagements with the Jewish community or with Israeli expats in those places. So you have, that's kind of like the vanguard. And because so many of them have studied in the West, especially, and traveled, You see that. Those in the business and the high tech and the finance sectors, of course, have had, business interactions with certainly the Jewish community that's lived there for, a good 20 years quietly, but is certainly a part of the Emirati community, but also Israelis who have been traveling there on visas and passports quietly for also a long time. You have some people who are quite learned and in regional affairs, in history, in religion, and they fully understand we'll call it the comparative religion. They understand how similar we are, how we come from the same sources. These are the ones who are also aware of the Mizrahi Jewish history, the indigenous Jewish history of the Middle East, and of the politics, and how many are simply just not aware. Some who have only met until recently most of the Emirati Jewish community, I think it would be safe to say, is Ashkenazi. And so many of them are shocked to find out about Mizrahi Jews. Right. I although my last name is Feferman, my mother's side is Iraqi Jews, and I tend to blend in, and I also speak Arabic. So people are shocked by this. And I say, actually, half of us, or more than half, have some kind of Mizrahi heritage. Right. Many of us speak Arabic. A lot of them are shocked that 20% of our country is actually Arab, mostly Muslim or Christian or Jews. They don't know that.
Right.
Many of them, especially, in the school system, so the ones who are a little older, were raised with kind of an anti-Israel, even an anti-Semitic sentiment in the school system. Of course, until recently, the Al Jazeera effect that only shows the conflict and only shows Israel in a negative light has its effects on people. So some of them are surprised by the multicultural aspect. Some of them are surprised at how secular Israelis can be. Some of them are surprised that more than half of Israelis are of Middle Eastern descent, and how much Middle Eastern culture is a part of this. Some of them know about the high tech, but they don't know about the tradition. Some of them know about, some of them know about Tel Aviv and not Jerusalem, and some of them know about Jerusalem and not Tel Aviv. Right. And some of them, many of them did not know how Arab Israel was. And so, everyone is surprised in different kind of ways. And what I'm finding is that they're very curious. It's an incredibly curious society in that sense, an incredibly open society in that sense.
Very interesting. There was a question from Dan here about your Dan Weintraub about Sharaka itself and how it's funded. Is that something you're comfortable talking about,
I have to say, we're a nonprofit. We do fundraising. Right now, most of our sources are in Israel and the United States, and we're working on other funding sources.
Great. Is that you think there might be opportunities for funding in the Arab countries?
Absolutely, because unlike a lot of other organizations, we really are a joint organization of Israelis and Arabs working together. The agenda is not an Israeli agenda; it is a Abraham Accords agenda. It's a regional agenda, and so I think it just takes. We're still learning the ropes of how things work in each country, and I'm very positive that we can get Arab World Philanthropy on board at one point or another, because what we're doing, serves a really positive, moderate agenda in the region.
Right, and I know you said at the beginning when you talked about that you sort of been flying around not only to the Gulf states but also to the US. And I mentioned your trip to the San Francisco. Are you in touch with, are there diaspora Jewish organizations either in the United States or anywhere else that are particularly supportive of this?
Yeah, we have great cooperation with almost all of them, I have to say.
That's great.
From the right and from the left, from those connected to Israel, from those less. We've had fascinating cooperation with African-American groups in the U.S. also, not connected to the Jewish community, trying to connect to political groups, Democrat and Republican, really working on connecting more to the American Muslim community. That's been a bit more of a challenge because it's been a bit more of a challenge, but working on that. And we have found nothing but open arms and support from certainly within the Jewish community.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
you mentioned when we were talking about Saudi Arabia, you mentioned about MSB, Mohammed, MBS, sorry, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, and obviously he's someone who was very close to the previous American administration, not close, it would seem, to the Biden administration. That's been critical of him publicly, and also has made a point of connecting him to the Khashoggi killing, and I think in the West generally he's seen negatively. Would that be fair?
Yeah. Look, during the time of the last administration, the Saudi regime was connected to the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi dissident journalist who was connected to the Washington Post, very critical of the government. He because of that, and because of how kind of Gulf politics and Gulf leaders are perceived, it drew a lot of criticism. There was the intelligence report, or the declassified version of the intelligence report that came out that implicated the Saudi regime, if I'm not mistaken, and parts of it. And I think the Saudi government did arrest and punish some of those involved. I don't want to get into that because I don't want to excusing or not excusing. Right. But what is interesting to me from talking to people from Saudi Arabia is that, this is a leader who's this has been said to me by Saudis. He's the only hope for certainly modernization in Saudi Arabia, women's rights, secular rights, opening it up, and eventually the Abraham Accords. And just from my point of view, I don't think the Abraham Accords would have happened without Saudi Arabia's blessing behind the scenes. Right.
That's really interesting and important, I think. I think one of the challenges is to, and something that's important for us to do, is to sort of separate the Israeli-Arab, the burgeoning Israeli-Arab relationships with domestic issues that are going on in broader Middle East politics.
Right, and it's hard to do for a lot of people. It's to say, to say to Americans, look, you hate Trump, but he achieved something. You hate Netanyahu, but he achieved something. You have to be able to look at the policy or the outcome and not be tied down by who this or that leader was. And vice versa. If you're a Republican and there's a Democratic regime or whatever it is, you have to be able to be pragmatic. You have to be able to look at the outcome and say, is the outcome good? Let's look at things in a regional context. Let's try to untangle things and not just lump everything into these broad categories of person A, good, person B, bad.
Right.
That doesn't help any of us.
Right. No, I agree. So there was a question here. I don't have a name because there's no name on the Zoom. But he or she asks. I think it's kind of a challenge to. I guess it's a challenge to your optimism. Really, it's asking whether other countries in the Middle East that are riven with the threat of Islamist factions and sort of violence in their societies, whether there's any chance in the near term of those countries making peace with Israel. And he or she mentions Iraq and Syria, but I guess you could also throw in, even in North Africa, Algeria, which I think responded quite negatively to Morocco signing the agreement.
Right.
Is that something should we be sort of say, okay, we can't make peace with everyone, but let's focus on the ones we can make peace with?
Yeah. I think that's the approach is achieve what you can and then try to bolster those achievements, which is what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure that those achievements, those countries that are on board, those peace agreements are resilient. And that's the whole point of our organization also, is let's make sure this translates down to the people level. Let's, the governments are hard at work, forging agreements across all aspects of society. Businesses are then coming in universities, hospitals, researchers, you name it, are coming together. Part of what we're trying to do is help bring those connections when we can, but also communicate the achievements and the benefits to the peoples of the region, to the rest of the peoples of the region. And the saying "Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor," just because you can't achieve everything,
right,
doesn't matter. You shouldn't be trying. A lot can be achieved. There is a bit of a snowball effect here, and the more you do, the more you show the achievements. A lot of those countries that are struggling with extremism are also struggling with unemployment, especially with youth bulge in their populations. They're all struggling with food security, water security, education, health issues. And there is a growing recognition, even just from the most pragmatic utilitarian sense, that Israel has a lot to offer in these areas. Why not connect to the most dynamic economy, the most dynamic society in the region? And then those who are also struggling with Iran, with extremism, with ISIS, with radical Islam, also recognize that Israel and its military and intelligence apparatus also have a lot to offer in these areas. So, the more that the benefits of these accords can be communicated across the region, the more people will want to come aboard this train.
Okay, great. So that's actually a really nice, positive way to finish. But I did get another question while you were talking. So I do want to ask Charlotte's question, which is: are you working with Jordan? And if I could throw Egypt into that question as well, and also say, if not, why not?
We do have a lot of interest from Egypt and from Jordan, from individuals who have reached out to us, from people who follow our social media. Just because we're a small organization, and we have to choose, where we started and where we focus. We are not at this point working in Egypt and Jordan. And I think those societies are also going to be a harder nut to crack. The level of anti-Israel sentiment and in those countries is stronger, frankly, than in other parts of the Middle East.
Yeah.
But, if someone magically, decided to donate the funding to open an Egypt unit or a Jordan unit or whatever unit, we would gladly take on that challenge. And I think we could make a lot of headway in any of the parts of the Arab or Muslim world which we chose to focus. We just, with the limited resources we have and the small staff of professionals and volunteers we have to choose where to start. And we're starting with the Gulf and hopefully soon Morocco. Okay.
Dan, it's fantastic news that you're bringing to us. It's we always need to hear of positive things happening in the Middle East, and this is, I think, one of the most positive things that we could be hearing about. And you're doing amazing work. So people can Google Sharaka, Sharaka. Where can they find your podcast?
So first of all, I will say follow Sharaka on whatever social media platform you are on. We have a website. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You're welcome to reach out to us, invite us to come talk. If you want to support us, you're welcome to support us. And we feel like we really are changing the world, and everyone, in whatever way they want to support, morally, social media, other ways, is welcome to do that. The podcast is called Jewanced, like nuanced, but with a J. You can find that on Facebook. We have a Jewanced page where you can see the live stream, similar to this format, every other week. And then you can download episodes. I think we're in the high 50s as far as number of episodes, with really fascinating guests on issues related to Israel and the Jewish world in the Middle East, on whatever podcast platform you are on. So Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Stitcher and all of those. And you can also go to the podcast website, Jewanced, JEWANCED.com.
Fantastic. Okay. And for those that are not on my mailing list, you can get on it. Email me, paulg@begincentre.org.il. I've written it in the chat, so you can get info from me about all these Wednesday evening and any other English programming that we do at the Begin Centre. I want to thank you all for joining us from wherever you are. To thank Dan again very much. Wish him b'hatzlacha and yishar koach for some amazing work. And I will see you all hopefully next week. Thank you all. Bye.
The website, by the way, is sharakang.com. sharakang.com.
Okay.
I saw somebody